I think solitary reading is about as bad an addiction as solitary drinking. One should drink with others, and one should read with others as well. Because you don't really find out what you've done with your mind unless you and somebody else, your wife or somebody else, your friends, have read the same book and you and they discuss it. The role of discussion, of conversation about serious matters, books read, discussed seriously and well, is the most fruitful of all the forms by which one grows up and one hopes becomes educated. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the Adab book club. As we do on a weekly basis, we gather and read we read the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun every week. If you'd like to participate in future sessions, such as this one here, just check the description box below or look at the link on screen right now. There is a Telegram channel where we have daily discussions, and on a weekly basis there will be a link invitation directly in that group so that you can participate as we're doing right now. Alhamdulillah. So today we're a quite timely and relevant topic, and we're going to utilize the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun as a guide for the general discussion, inshallah. At the time of recording today, which is, we are to the 18th and 19th of April 2025, 16th of April 2025. It's quite an eventful week, actually, in the world of Islam, and we have really, for the last 100 years, come across a certain milestone, actually, something that hasn't been seen for a very long time, and in the specific context of Jerusalem, has really not been seen before, quite frankly. We are witnessing right now the awakening or the reawakening of a uniform scholastic voice from around the Muslim world coming together unanimously, almost unanimously, to enforce a fatwa and to call for the Muslim governments to take action militarily against Israel. So this is something that we have not seen at least in the 100 years we've actually experienced as a global ummah. We've not seen something like this before. Although we have come close in 1914 when the Young Turks with the Germans concocted a scheme to mobilize the Muslims globally against the Allies. That was something close to what we're seeing today. But again, that was only the scholars in Turkey. It wasn't a resounding call from all scholars or most scholars around the Muslim world. Later on in the 80s, we saw something quite similar again, when the Americans, with the Saudi establishment and other Gulf nations, declared a fatwa against the Soviets who were in Afghanistan. So these are the two instances in the last 100 years where we have seen official call for jihad, an official call, a general call for jihad by scholars of a state. Okay. Now this one in 2025 is particularly different because this is a result of a concerted effort, a coordinated effort by the muftis. And again, in the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun will tell us about the political structure of a sultanate or khilafah and the position of a mufti or a wazir in that environment. These are very, very high-ranking officials that in a secular world may oftentimes not be, their position is not appreciated for what it is. But in a religious world, in an Islamic world, the mufti is in many cases only second to the sultan in that sense. And the Grand Mufti, you could say, Shaykh al-Islam, is perhaps even under certain administrations, is either equal to and sometimes a bit higher than the Sultan in terms of his religious authority and his, you could say, influence over state affairs. So to see that there is an international union of Muslim scholars, these are senior ranking muftis who have come together and who have issued a resounding call for jihad to be waged in Palestine, it is by no means an insignificant and inconsequential decision. Now, I think many Muslims this week have missed this memo and don't realize the magnitude and the importance of such a thing happening in our lifetime. It is of tremendous value and of tremendous significance to us. How the Muslim governments will respond in weeks and perhaps months to come, that is still to be seen. But we have crossed a certain threshold that hitherto has not been seen. We have not seen something like this for a very long time. Yeah, so it's very interesting, but it's also timely for us to understand how does this work? Because if this fatwa is taken at face value and the Muslim governments respond to it, how does it work? Okay, what is the procedure? How is it supposed to work in the ideal Muslim state? So we're going to look at Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, and we're going to try to understand the positioning of these sorts of rulings, but also who is a mufti, what is a mufti, and in the general sense of things, what is the influence of a mufti in state affairs, or are there other players that a ruler should rely upon for his decision making? Yeah, so it's a very, very topical discussion, and I think we should always be informed and aware as to how these things work, because earlier this week I put a very basic opinion poll on the YouTube channel just to get the general gist of where people are, you know. So now we've reached the point where there is actually a fatwa. We're no longer calling for boycotting or for a protest per se. The actual fatwa has been issued for a jihad. Where does that leave the general Muslim public? Are people prepared to join this jihad, to support the jihad, to fund the jihad, right? And many people have been startled by this question because it came out of the blue. Nobody thought this would actually happen. So now that we're confronted with this reality, how do we react? Okay, how do we react? As you know, the jihad, when it is officially sanctioned and endorsed by grand muftis, it is incumbent upon everybody. Fard ayn. It is incumbent upon everybody. So this is something that now, again, it is more timely than ever that we understand how these things work. What does it mean for us? And how's an Islamic state actually supposed to be governed and operate? So we're going to look at the principles or the general guide to the system of Islamic governance. This is a very, very brief, very concise discussion. It's not exhaustive. We want to delve into the exhaustive history and the parameters of Islamic governance. There is currently an annual program on the Historiyun platform that dedicates a lot of time just on this topic. In fact, the last session we had 2 weeks ago was a 7-hour live stream, and that was just an introduction. Okay, so if you really find that this is something you want to delve into and learn more about, I would highly recommend you check out the Historiyun annual program. And the program is called How to Be a Caliph. How to Be a Caliph. It is taught by a qualified student of knowledge who actually has a postgraduate in this field, international relationships and politics, but also has studied the seminal work written in the Sunni tradition by Imam al-Mawardi, Ahkam al-Sultaniyya. So we're learning from a classical text with a qualified teacher in this field. And it is of essential importance that we, especially this generation, come to understand how governance works in the Muslim realms. It is far too late and far too little for us to keep talking about the same issue of let's revive the Khilafah. We need to know what that means in practical terms. You know, the sound bites, the cliches that we oftentimes parrot. Not knowing what this means, it has to come to an end. If we're really working towards this, we need to understand what are the prerequisites, what are the qualified parameters of these things, so that when we do come across a fatwa, we know what to do and who should be doing what. We know where to place the expectations, the responsibilities, and also the procedure. Okay, so it's very, very important. And again, if you'd like to know more about that program, you could check the Historiyun website, and it's available currently for 2025, and you'll be able to benefit from that program. So before we begin, just a general general discussion. Has anyone had the opportunity to read, and what is the general kind of sentiment towards this? How are people feeling about this? Are we feeling hopeful? Are we feeling relieved? Are we feeling a bit of trepidation? Are we nervous? Are we lost? Are we confused? What is the general feeling? Does anyone have any initial kind of commentary on this? How do you feel about this?
It's not like um, from a personal observations, especially me because who born I'm 23 this year. So it had happened before in the Soviet war. I'm confused. The first thing is like I've been studying a lot of history. I'm confused, but I do take this serious, especially when it's like come from basically like when the Pakistani ulama confirm it. They actually said it. The Qaswani went up and he said it last year too. I repeat again, he said it last year because nobody take him. It was brushed off, but this time he was basically confirming. I'm kind of confused, and I was like, now what? And I'm concerned of a lot of reactions are very. They're saying, oh, this is just a service, right? Why now? You know, what about other countries? Like same thing happened in Yemen and Sudan. Why don't they say anything about it? Then a lot of peoples are more like emotionally burst out. They start putting fingers as ulamas. Me personally, more concerned about, okay, what can I do as a person, and how much? What is my istita'a, right? What is my capacities? Like, basically, what can I do at this point? Because the moment when I see it, I did read the caravans of the during the caravans of Sheikh Abdul Azim. I read the books. I read whole books, and I kind of get reliefs, some sort of reliefs, because I could basically parallel it, understanding what's going on. At the same time, I don't see like the same structure, the same thing happen in that time. So I'm confused. Conclusion is confused, and I don't know as an individual, like what is my capacities.
Very good. Barakallahu feekum. Anyone else have any commentary? You can type it in, or you could just speak on the mic, inshallah. Anyone have any strong feelings for or against Brother Owais?
Yeah, so
Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam. Can everyone hear me?
Very well, Barakallahu feekum. Very
Yes.
well.
Okay, excellent. I just wanted to just add to what the brother was saying previously. In terms of our capacity, or in terms of what we can do, I think at the very least, living in the West, we can raise awareness. So can everyone hear me?
Very well, very well.
Okay,
very
cool.
well.
So, go ahead. One thing that comes to mind is when studying the life of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahmatullah alayhi, at the time, Nuruddin Zengi and others around Salahuddin who were Salahuddin's mentors, these great individuals were influenced by the likes of the famous scholar, my mind's gone blank, Abdul Qadir Jilani, the works of Abdul Qadir Jilani, who was in Iraq at the time, Imam Ghazali. They were influenced by the works of these scholars. And if we look at Palestine back then, Palestine was occupied for 90 odd years. They were thereabouts, and during those 90 years, the Muslims raised a lot of awareness about the liberation of Palestine. And Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahmatullah alayhi was born into that environment and was raised in that environment. And Salahuddin was a product of that struggle that the Muslims undertook of creating awareness for the liberation of Palestine. And I think there's parallels between that time and today, in the sense that we're living in a time where Palestine is occupied, but we have the opportunity of creating awareness for the liberation of Palestine and highlighting what Islam has to say about the liberation of Palestine, just like Muslims did back then, in the 12th century. And I see similarities between that situation and today. And I think, yes, the situation does look tough, it does look bleak, but our Iman, tells us, our Islam tells us to be positive and optimistic. And I am optimistic about the future. And I think, me as an individual, I can, inshallah, do whatever I can, in my capacity, which is to create awareness. And yes, I may not see the liberation of Palestine in my lifetime, but Yawm al-Qiyamah, I want to be in a position where I can say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, Ya Allah, I did my best. And I think that's something we can all strive for, is to create, the awareness for the liberation of Palestine, and to highlight the Islamic solution to the problem of Palestine, which is liberation. And then ultimately, liberation will happen by those who have the power and the authority, within the Muslim world. And I think, us living in the West, we should reach out to the powers that be and remind them of their Islamic obligation of liberating Palestine. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu fikum. Barakallahu fikum, brother Wise. Brother Sultan also wanted to speak. Brother Sultan. Or the brother
Assalamu
Osman.
alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, regarding what my brothers have said, actually my own opinion is, one of the problems that I think we have is I don't see any victory. I don't want to be, how will I say, I'm not despairing, but I think based on the system that we are running now in the Middle East, like generally in the Muslim world, I don't think victory is gonna come like this. It's gonna come. It's not. I don't think we are going to be victorious based on the system that we are running of government. Because if you check, the Muslim world is divided. Yes, like my brother said, during the time of Salahuddin and now, I think there's a difference in terms of the psychology. Back then, they joining hands and doing jihad is easy compared to now. But now, like we are so diverse. I don't know how to say it. First of all, we have the sectarian part. We have the political part. Like a Muslim now, a Muslim of Saudi Arabia does not see a Muslim of, let's say, America as just a Muslim, but he sees him as a American Muslims. But what I'm trying to point out is, for now, we don't see ourselves as just Muslims purely. Majority of us, not all of us, but we see ourselves as, let's say, an American Muslim or Canadian Muslim. We still have this nationality embedded within our mind. And also, one thing, just a hypothesis that I will just present is, let's say, for example, somebody rise up, wants to bring a change. Somebody, like, the first thing we look in that person is not the Islam, but rather we look at, okay, what is his Akida, what does he believe in? Yes, I know Akida is part of the package, I know, but still, we always find this reason to segment ourselves, to like cut somebody off. So we need to remove all these barriers that have blocked our eyes for victory to come, based on my own perspective.
Barakallahu fikum, brother Osman.
Yeah, so
Wa
my
alaikum
opinion.
assalam.
Yeah, so my opinion, can you hear me well?
Very well, very well.
Yeah, my opinion is, I think at face value, it might be something good, that there's some progress in the ulama class, but in reality, I think Palestine is not the priority for many of these countries right now. For example, there's still a lot of things in Syria and Turkey going on. There's the Saudi and the Iran. And for them to just drop it for Palestine, I don't see that happening. And furthermore, many of the nations that issued this ruling, they're very far away from the conflict. Libya, Indonesia, Pakistan. If something were to go down, they're not the ones that are going to pay the price. It's going to be the nations that are more closer. So I think strategically, the priorities in the world are not at the moment directed towards Palestine, but more national interests. And there still needs to be a lot of development and progression to stabilize other parts before, the ultimate goal.
SubhanAllah. Brother Sultan.
So, like, sorry, Ustad, I would like to say something regarding what the brother said. Like, now, this is also one of the factors that we should consider. It's not all about doing the jihad. First of all, we need proper leadership. We can't just march together, or all of us just barge into, let's say, Gaza and fight for them. It doesn't work like that. We need structure. How do we maintain the order? Like, how do we maintain that proper order? Maybe let's say, for example, if we went on an expedition against the Zionists or against those that want to erase us, you see. So, and also those countries that are close to, let's say, Palestine, all of them, like Brother Sufyan said, they have their own national interest. And if you check, basically they don't have that zeal to liberate that place. They don't have that zeal to free them initially. Everybody's just chasing his own interest. So now, how would you go? Let's say, for example, you are living maybe in the West, or let's say in Africa, and the call of jihad by these scholars, let's say you respond to the call and you go, like, how sure are you that what kind of, I don't even know, I can't even logically, like, I can't even process it in my mind. Like, how would you even go to the Gaza and say you want to fight when actually those people that are surrounding you don't even give a damn about what is going on there? So initially, like, I think some things have to be set in place for us to achieve victory, or for us to actually respond to such call.
Well, Brother Sultan, he's been waiting for a while.
Yeah, Assalamualaikum. Yeah,
Walaikum salam.
so just with what you said initially, how are you feeling? What comes to my mind is, I'm confused, like I'm frustrated, I'm worried for the future when it comes to it. I think a lot of us have these feelings. We've been seeing protests and we're trying to do the best we can with, giving charity, but we see in the news like, even, things can't even make it past the border. And I think there was something that happened in the Middle East. I don't know where exactly, but some Uzbekistan, like three guys killed some general. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think it just comes from frustration because everyone has sees the social media and it hurts our heart. We only can see so much. And I think really this from the scholars, I see it like kind of like as a power play to hopefully influence the Muslim leaders because at the end of the day, I think they're just afraid like to do anything or they're just so entwined, with the system. Like we look at case studies from, JFK and King Faisal getting assassinated and either it's they're weak or they're just, they're afraid. But with this, like, honestly, I think you're right. It's a very profound thing because if you look back at what happens, these scholars are basically saying, like, they're probably going to get thrown in jail. And it's very courageous of them to do it. I'm glad something's, they got together to do something, and hopefully it does influence these Muslim leaders to, because they can do something, they can. But like the brother said, we don't have a head, and you know, I'm just really at the end of the day, I'm just frustrated at everything.
Barakallahu feekum. Barakallahu feekum. I said it's quite a very significant milestone in our collective experience. We've never seen this before. We've never seen this before. Okay, it's not just another news soundbite. This week something happened again. No, this is very significant. It is as if the body of the ummah is trying to do something, but the brain is dead, right? So it's like a comatose situation. The body is perhaps ready, but the brain is not yet ready to engage. So where do we go from there? Yeah. There's no uniformity. Who do we turn to as a single figure of authority who can then enforce this, for example? In which border do we unite and go towards to mobilize? Which army do we use as as infantry? Who will give training? What about the mass migration towards the region? Which corridor do we go through? So many questions, right? So many questions that just are not being answered. We're just seeing fatwa, but what's the actual implementation? So it is a generational challenge now that we prepare so that when this call is made again, we have structure and systems in place to enact the call. There's no point giving a fatwa if there is no means of affecting that fatwa. There's no point. It's just another gesture, but it doesn't have any weight behind it. So I don't believe personally that any of the Muslim nations will respond to this fatwa. I don't believe that at all. But I believe it is symbolic, and it is of course something that gives us. It is literally a milestone in modern history that we're seeing this happen. And Brother Tahmid says he believes the fatwa was to start a movement that will align, to basically divide rank between those ulama, those scholars who are pro-Palestine and making efforts towards liberating Palestine, and those who will be basically exposed for not being in support of this. This is his opinion on that. It's a beginning to separate, to draw rank between these types of scholars. Brother Yunus.
Yes, Ustad, if I can add something, I think that it's also like if you want the last veil that just like disappeared. So in some way, the ulama were like the muftis and ulama were like, let's say, protecting leaders because they could just say that we are not intervening because religiously we don't have to. But now this last let's say veil has been like it has vanished. So all the responsibility of what's happening in Gaza is now on the leaders. I think it's like it's one of the goals behind those fatwas.
You're right, it has lifted a veil, but not only on the leaders, also on us.
Yes, Ustad, it's true.
There's a triangulation where we keep shifting blame. So the leaders will say, well, the religious authorities or the international community is not supporting us. The scholars will say the leaders, maybe we're advising them behind the scenes, or the people are not ready. The people will say the scholars and the leaders are not ready. They're not giving us the go-ahead. So now that this has been given as a go-ahead, all of us are exposed, quite frankly, to be honest with
But
you. As I said before, a fatwa such as this one is basically it's a fatwa that is general.
yeah, Ustad, but I would argue that if you see like the last protests in I mean mainly in Muslim countries, which I have seen. I don't know about every country, but I have seen some. You can even see like the population like ready to go fight. They are like calling the leaders like to make it happen if you want. So I think it's really like putting the projectors on leaders, at least like in my view.
Okay, so let's begin, inshallah. Let's get a bit of context around this. What would Ibn Khaldun say in this situation, for example? So Ibn Khaldun on the principles of Islamic governance. Okay, we want to understand from a principle base, not just emotions and sensationalism. We want to understand from principle base, how do these things are supposed to be structured? Who has, as our brother mentioned, Sultan, that influence, that's a very key term here. Influence is a very key term. So we're going to read into that, inshallah. So in his Muqaddimah, he has a chapter on the ranks and the importance of two specific, you could say, cabinets within the Islamic State. These are the people of the sword and the people of the pen. Okay, the people of the sword and people of the pen. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of the proverbial saying that the pen is mightier than the sword, right? So the pen and the sword is something that is oftentimes brought up, a symbolic of the military might of a nation, but also of its diplomatic ability and its influence, its soft power. Okay, so the pen and the sword. So Ibn Khaldun talks of these two elements within the Islamic State. So he begins to say it should be known that both the pen and the sword are instruments for the ruler to use in his affairs. Okay, this should be known. This is, again, as I said before, it's quite a universal convention. People know of this, the pen and the sword, right? Or the carrot and the stick. So this should be known that even before you engage upon political discussion and you have arguments or debates, or you want to pontificate about what should happen at the state level, you need to know and be reminded that both of these components are necessary. It's not just a matter of jihad. It's the sword and the pen, right? It's not just the sword everywhere or just the pen every time. You need both of these. They are both instrumental for the ruler of a nation to manage his affairs. Both of these, okay? I remember in the early 2000s reading a pamphlet on the jihad of the pen. Okay, this was a discussion ongoing. As you know, London, if you know about London and the UK in the 90s and 2000s, was a hot spot for jihadi activity, ideology, and just many things happen in London. It was a hot spot for that. So the issue of jihad was, if you went to any of the inner circles of, you could say da'wah meant a different thing back then, or Islamic circles, durus, halaqat, you would find that the issue of jihad was oftentimes mentioned. Okay, and you typically had two camps. The first camp was jihad bisayf, jihad by the sword. Okay, these were people who wanted to to fix the issues of the ummah through the sword, and primarily through the sword. And at the extreme end, for them, the pen was a sign of weakness and sometimes a sign of almost betrayal. So they would not consider the issue of negotiating or diplomacy. For them, this was beyond the pale of possibility. Everything was to be solved by jihad through the sword. So they only knew that, jihad by the sword. And all of their talking points was around jihad by the sword. Okay, so those people today, had they been alive, or if they were in their prime today, would rush to answer the call of these muftis. Okay, we've seen it in the 1980s, in the 1990s. We've seen it in Chechnya. We've seen it in Bosnia. We've seen it in Afghanistan. So we've seen wherever there was even a minor jihad given, a minor fatwa given for jihad, people would rush. Okay, which is why I find it strange that this is what we're seeing today, something we've not seen before, that major scholars at the state level are given a fatwa for jihad. And I don't see the mobilization that we witnessed in the 90s and 2000s, when there were even fewer people speaking about jihad, as a scholar giving jihad, giving legitimacy for jihad. So it's really odd. It's really odd that we have this effect today. Nevertheless, there was a dichotomy, because there were those speaking about jihad by the sword only. And then there were those people who were focusing purely on jihad by the pen. And I remember reading a pamphlet on this, the jihad by the pen ideology, that we need to put the sword away. The sword has no utility to us today. We need to do jihad by the pen. And this means through persuasive skills, negotiation, diplomatic means, dialogue, influence, soft power, so on and so forth. So the jihad by the pen, and I think this became the predominant narrative following 9/11. That was a shift in culture. Following 9/11, the issue of jihad by the pen became more prominent. And I remember going to masajid shortly thereafter and seeing literal posters on the masjid wall with things that you cannot mention or you cannot say in these premises. One of them was to mention jihad. Okay? It became taboo. To this very day, I think jihad is a statement or as a word, or even I see people in the comments saying, for example, we need to make jihad, and they spell jihad in cryptic terms, right? So J dot 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 D, right? So they don't even have the courage to write jihad and they want to make jihad, right? So it's an aftermath of what we experienced in 9/11, 2001. But the problem is both of these are extremes, and no Muslim administration, even under the Sultan, would operate purely on jihad by the sword. It's ridiculous, quite frankly. It's infantile, and it's very naive to believe that the only way you can affect change in this world is by means of the sword or military action. Neither is it possible to maintain your realms just through the pen. You need both of them. And I think people who are well read in history and in political affairs and who are honest with themselves, they know you need both. You need both. You can't talk your way out of oppression. Likewise, you can't fight your way out of difficult situations every time. You need both. So it's very good that he begins by saying both of these are necessary. And we have to sometimes temper our narrative by reminding people it's not always by the sword, brother. Or it's not always by the pen. Sometimes you need to also pick up an arm, okay, and liberate the land. All of these things have to be kept in measure and in mind. So he begins now to tell us, although you need both of them, okay, they will not always be equal. So it depends on which time frame you're at, your situation. Sometimes the pen is more effective, and sometimes the sword is more effective, right? You need to know when to use each one of these instruments, okay? You need to know when to use the instrument. There's no point using the pen when it's time to fight, and there's no point wielding the sword when it's time to come to terms with reality on the ground. So he mentions at the beginning of a dynasty, so long as its people are occupied in establishing power, the need for the sword is greater than for the pen. So in other words, when you're starting out, when there's a new dynasty being carved, when there is an upward momentum to establish a state, then at that point, the sword is more effective. Okay, if you want to establish a state, you want to conquer a land, you want to liberate a land. At that state, diplomacy is not really the best option. You need to go for the sword. Okay? And we've seen this in history. The American establishment was not by the pen. The pen came later. It was by the sword first and foremost to get independence from Britain. Right? So it had to be by the sword. Diplomacy wouldn't work there. Okay, you don't liberate yourself just by diplomacy. You need to find a way to bring those people to the negotiating table, and then you can use the pen to get what you need. So when establishing a state, the pen is not useful. Okay, it's the sword that works. And again, in historical terms, there are many examples of this. Okay, all around the world. I'm giving examples here that make sense. If we look at, for example, South Africa, Nelson Mandela at some point was considered a terrorist, a state terrorist. For that reason, he was put in jail for several decades. But he did not begin his journey with just the pen. Okay, sometimes he had to take arms and attack certain locations and inflict damage. Okay, on the enemy. This was part of the liberation struggle. Okay, and this is undeniable. Now, that happens across the world. Wherever you go, where there was once a people who were oppressed and are now running the country, it was always initially by the sword. They had to use strength and might to push their advantage. Likewise, Yasser Arafat, we know before he came to the table, okay, before he became a more diplomatic figure under the PA, it was the PLO. And you had the Fedayeen, for example. You had the Black September, right? You had the Battle of Amman. You had military or guerrilla attacks and guerrilla missions. Okay, so these were things that it was by the sword until it came to the pen later on. They came to negotiating and they changed their position. Likewise, Jolani, or Ahmed Shara, as he's now known, president of Syria, it was by the sword for a long time. Okay, he didn't just wake up one day suddenly, here's Syria, and go and make the tour of the Arab world, drawing together allyship. No, it was the sword for a long time. Okay. Likewise, perhaps the best example in modern history is Saudi Arabia. How long, just a quick question for the audience, how long do you think it took Ibn Saud to get to the point where he can be diplomatic? Because he spent a large time of his life fighting by the sword. Okay, this is not something that should be a shock to anyone. But how long do you think it took him to come to the point where he could put the sword away and rely on the pen? How many years it is penned?
Decades.
How many?
Probably decades, couple of decades.
Yeah, give me an estimate. Give me an estimate.
More than
20
20 years.
20 years.
20 years, okay. Another estimate?
It's more than 30 years.
Okay, it took him exactly 30 years. From 1902 to 1932. Exactly 3 decades. 30 years. Imagine 30 years. And that 30 years, he was going around the Hijaz fighting. It was just fighting. 30 years. It's known as the unification of Saudi Arabia. The unification or of the Hijaz before it came to be known as Saudi Arabia. 30 years. 30 years it took, right? Until he can acquire what we know, what is known in political science as tamkin. Tamkin is when you have basically secured the land and you can now be diplomatic. It took 30 years, from 1902 to 1932, okay? And then he became diplomatic. So this is the reality of power. It's the reality of power. So he says at the beginning, it is necessary to use a sword, okay? If you look at Israel, Israel is an entity. How did that begin? We know. It was also by the sword, right? 1948. And then the 6-Day War, and then the Suez Crisis, which was an offensive against Egypt. Egypt did not initiate that. It was an offensive with the French against Egypt. So by the sword, okay? And look at all the great nations today that flourish by the sword. Britain, the empire over which the sun never sets. How did Britain get to that status among world nations? By the sword, okay? Typically by the sword. And that's just the way things are, unfortunately. That's how human beings are. So, as I say, it's better to say sorry than to seek permission. It's better to say sorry than to say please. So it's better just to seize it and then seek forgiveness later than to seek permission first. Yeah, That's just the way it is. But always.
Just to add to what you're saying, Jazakallah khair, you're absolutely right. If you look at modern history, a lot of these powers emerged through fighting. I mean, if you look at America as well, America, was once a colony of Britain, and that, through fighting and through the American Revolution, etc., emerged as a power. But I think our Islamic history, and if you look at the Khilafah Rashida period, yes, there was fighting, but the Khilafah Rashida was quite unique in the sense that it became known as a state of justice. And, when reading the works of historians such as Hugh Kennedy, for example, in his book, The Great Arab Conquest, he cites many examples of where non-Muslims were writing to the Khalifa and asking the Khalifa to come and liberate them, because the Khilafah back then became a state of justice, the Khilafah Rashida. And the reason why I raise this, because the reason why I raise this is due to the fact that I think our history is different in the sense that I'm not saying our history was perfect. Yes, there were dark periods, but, Muslims were known for justice and for implementing justice and for being fair. And I don't think these attributes can be applied to the Americans or the British, because everyone knows what the American Empire and the British Empire did around the world, whereas Muslims, and again, just to emphasize, I'm not saying our history is perfect. There were bad patches, or there were bad periods in our history, but by and large Muslims were known for their justice. And I think one of the key evidences of this is that the areas they went to, people in their thousands, in their droves, embraced Islam, because the masses, they saw they saw the justice in Islamic governance. And I think that's the power of Islam, which I guess we lack today. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feekum.
I'd like to add something.
I will challenge that. I disagree wholeheartedly, actually, on all counts. Yeah, healthy disagreements. In fact, it was a sword, and I know this is something I've had discussions with colleagues. We've had back and forth, but I'm very consistent on this one. It was the sword that kept Islam stable at the beginning. Okay, because as soon as the Prophet ﷺ passes away, immediately, right, the community was divided. And in fact, there are some tribes who had recently converted to Islam who are now rejecting basic principles of Islam. What did it take for that situation to be resolved and for stability to be brought back? It took for Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu to wage literally wage war. He had to use the sword. Right? It was only after that there was stability. He had to show strength and resolve. He could not negotiate his way out of that one. Okay, so the sword was absolutely necessary. Now, in regards to other nations calling Muslims in for justice, two things. The sword and justice are not mutually exclusive. You can use the sword and still be just. It doesn't have to be by peaceful means, okay? You can use the sword and still enforce justice. The second thing is, those people who call the Muslims, it wasn't only because of justice. Let's not romanticize history. It was because the Muslims had the muscle and the momentum necessary to repel the Byzantine emperors and for example, in Egypt, okay, they invited the Muslims in because of the taxations, the oppressive conditions under which they were actually being ruled by Byzantine governors. They were overtaxing the people. They didn't call the Muslims because you guys are more, we consider you to be better. They called them in because they were a better alternative in terms of the governance, the fiscal policy. So they called them in, and they supported the Muslims in the army to help them get rid of those who were ruling over them. Likewise, many regions where the Sassanid Empire was also very oppressive. That's why it's important when we study the history of Islam, we study it as part of world history. There is no utility in studying Islamic history just by itself. You need to study it as world history so you can understand the context in which it arrived in many parts of the world. People were literally sick and tired of being oppressed by the Christians from Europe and Mediterranean, basically, Eastern Roman Empire, and by the Persians, because up until that point, it was about 400 years between Byzantium and Persia. 400 years of incessant warfare. This is why we're having Surah Ar-Rum, Ghulibat Ar-Rum, talks about one of the incidents, one of the episodes. 400 years, right? So that perpetual warfare, it depleted the resources in those regions. It depleted the people. It was exhaustive, and they had had enough. So when the Muslims come about, and this is a third player in the region, naturally people want a solution to their problems, so they invited the Muslims in. And they did so because they came carrying swords, quite frankly. Okay, if the Muslims came carrying pens and flowers, they would not be useful. They could not liberate those regions with just pens and flowers. They came with swords. The pens came later. So once the land was liberated or annexed, then the pen came about. So now we have to govern this region. We need to set laws in place to safeguard the minorities in the region. The pen comes afterwards. And it is under that circumstance that the people came to see Islam and experience it in terms of a governing body. Now they can compare, okay, when Muslims rule over us, we have this level of freedom or this level of social mobility compared to what we were experiencing under the Persians and the Romans. So it came afterwards. But the point I'm making here is that the sword came, and the sword is necessary to initiate, first of all, stabilize the Arabia, and secondly, as it was expanding, other regions were then conquered through the sword, and then Islam came later on in terms of how it was established. And even then, to be quite fair, if you look at North Africa, the Berbers revolted several times. There was injustice. Those of you who studied with me last year, the Umayyad Kingdom, you know what happened in North Africa and those regions, and also in Khorasan. Okay, so it wasn't just because Muslims were perfect governors, it was because they used the pen when it was right to use the pen, and they used the sword very skillfully when it was right to use the sword. There's no shame in that. Okay, we need to stop hiding behind a semblance of a perfect past, because no civilization grew initially just because of justice. I want you to name me a single civilization that expanded just on the basis of being just, even up until today. Yeah, this is something that's very, very rare. So yeah, I mean, I disagree on that base, but again, it's just to give context. Brother Anas.
If anybody interested in like knowing like how it's like before the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the most summarized history that I ever read personally is by Maulana Abu Hassan Ali Nadu, rahimahullah. It's called Islam in the World. If we read that, we will understand what is a situation, political, economical situation like in the time of, like the sixth hijri, the sixth century. He explained it there in very brief and poetic, like very brief and poetic like way. If anybody want to like understand that, I would personally recommend to go read that book, especially the first 30 pages where he explained it very brief, the world history, what it's like, you know, in time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We talk about the Romans and everybody, including the North Europeans and everybody. I 100% agree with Ustaz Ibrahim. Like a lot of our Muslims go into, you know, like a lot of circumstances, we have that fantasy thing. Islam is spread up by not spread by the sword, but they were, you know, spread by basically flower. This is what they saying, right? But the reality is something else, and that word itself is propaganda, I will say, that was built by the Islamophobics, you know, to basically make us believe that. And you know, that's how.
I think your mic has been muted, Brother Wise, and Brother Anas.
Oh,
okay, yeah, it's not. We shouldn't be ashamed. This is the thing again, and it's why I'm an advocate for world history. Okay, I think the Muslim community is isolated when it comes to history. We tend to only be focusing on our history, and we study it in silos. When you study it in silos, you don't appreciate the impact it had in the world generally, first and foremost, but also just what it takes for an empire to thrive and survive. You need to understand how other nations were actually at that time surviving, how they came about, the condition of people under those administrators. So you can compare properly what Islam meant when it entered Egypt, for example, when it entered Khorasan, for example, because these regions were previously under the Sassanid emperors and under the Byzantine emperors, and they were not the best when it came to, they gave certain rights to the subjects, but there were also many things that the subjects didn't benefit from. So there was socio-economic incentive and benefit by having the Muslims coming as a third base to offer something different. Okay, so that was something that had to be, we have to acknowledge that as well. And then, of course, certainly, once the Muslims established themselves in these regions and the civilization becomes real. So, for example, I often say that the empire of Islam spread by the sword, but the spirit of Islam, sorry, the empire of Islam was spread by the sword, but the spirit of Islam was spread by the people, the kind words, the interactions, the traders, you know, the mu'amalat, the social intercourse and interaction. That's what spread Islam. Because, again, if you studied the Umayyad kingdom last year, we made a distinction between Islamization and Arabization. Okay, Islamization and Arabization. So, yes, it is correct to say that Islam, the heart, was spread by peaceful means. That is completely true, because you can't force people to be Muslims. But the empire, which makes it possible for Islam to spread, that was spread by the sword. And it's always the case, doesn't matter which civilization you look at, it's always spread by the sword. At the beginning phase, it is always by the sword. Okay, if you doubt that, name me a single civilization that was spread just by peaceful means. Yeah? These are things that we don't read in the books of history. All right, so Brother Sufyan, I think your hand is raised. Brother Sufyan.
Yes, Ustad, I can say, like, I do agree with you on your points, but another point is, when Islam spread to different regions, you know, we didn't do what the West did, you know, because most of the people living on that land remained there, and they just integrated with the newcomers. But we never tried to completely wipe out a population, like ever. So we didn't go to that ranks like, you know, the Western empires have done. And regarding America liberating itself from Britain, I mean, I think the Americans are basically just the long lost cousins of you guys up in the British Isles. They came here to take away another people and to eliminate another people. And that's how this country was created. And so Islam, we never had that in Islam.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Islam does not. It's like Ibn Taymiyyah said, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, Islam is a polish, not a hammer. Islam is a polish, not a hammer. Islam comes to polish something, all right, and to restore its brilliance. It's not a hammer that's coming to destroy something. As an instrument, Islam is a polish, okay? So you refurb the apartment rather than demolishing it. So no, we didn't go anywhere and destroy the people and destroy the culture and destroy civilization. We went to develop it. Now, of course, there were certain instances where that did happen. Certain rulers did go and destroy, okay? But by and large, it wasn't the case. I said, no, Umar radiallahu anhu enters Jerusalem. He doesn't destroy. He gives them a charter and rights and conditions. In fact, when he was invited to pray, I think in the Holy Sepulchre, one of those main landmarks in the Christian world in Jerusalem, he refused to pray there. The reason being, he said, if I pray here, this site will become a historical site for the Muslims, and they will claim this land and this property, this church, as Islamic. So I will not pray here so that it will not be claimed by later Muslims. Instead, he prayed outside, and where he prayed outside is now a small masjid. Yeah, so we didn't go to destroy the people. The only reason why Islam goes to other lands is to expand and to broaden the reach of the message. And if the leadership in that land either accept to pay jizya or tribute, or they go to war and they lose, then that rank is removed and the governorship enters, but the people are not, they're not forced by the sword. They don't face the sword. That's a very different thing. We don't destroy the civilization. We just you engage at the government level, and that's how the Prophet ﷺ engaged. Yeah, so there's a difference, definitely a difference there.
Yeah, it's kind of cringe when Muslims mention America as like some kind of model, because the founding of America was not a happy time for millions of people. If we do read the history about America.
Yeah, it's not, because Winston Churchill, he won a Nobel Literary Award for historiography, and he said that this has been said before, but I think he brought it to the forefront, that the victors get to write history. The victors get to write history, or history is written by the winners, by the victors. And then he said, I know, because I intend to do that when I win. I know this is true because I intend to do exactly that. So of course, if you win, you get to write history again. You use the pen to rewrite history, okay, to efface the errors or the transgressions of how you got to power. You rewrite history, okay, but you can only do that if you have power in the first place. So the sword precedes the pen. That's the point. That's the lesson we have to learn here. So the beginning of establishing something. So if the Muslims of today, I'm going to be very open and frank, if you're imagining the revival of a khilafah, of a central governance of the Muslims, you're not going to do it by the pen. Yeah, if you imagine you're going to do it by the pen, you need to wake up immediately. You're not going to achieve that by the pen. Yeah? Nobody achieves it by the pen. That's one thing to keep in mind. Yeah, you're not going to achieve that by the pen. So he then goes on to say, quite interestingly, in that situation, as in the beginning phase, the pen is merely a servant and an agent of the ruler's authority, but the sword contributes active assistance. In other words, the pen or diplomacy is something that may be of use for the ruler, okay, but the sword is the active instrument. It is the sword that he's holding on to. It's the same as, again, we look at Saudi Arabia, because it's perhaps one of the best examples in the current Muslim world of this having worked properly. That he used the sword all the way. For 30 years, he used the sword all the way, okay? Ibn Saud was involved in many battles. His sons were involved in many battles. He went into war. He entered alliances with the British and with other people. And then, so he was using the pen all the way. Up until he gets to the position where he's got tamkeen over the land. He's consolidated his wins. And he now wants to position himself as a ruler, as a king of that region. At this point, he drops the sword, okay? He drops the sword. As we know, his army turn against him. Ikhwan man ata Allah turn against him. And in the battle of Sabillah, he wipes them out. And now he goes for the diplomatic approach. From that moment onwards, he uses the pen. Okay. So when the sword is no longer necessary, when you've established yourself, now you can use the pen. In other words, the use of the pen in diplomacy is only effective when you have power and authority. When you have power and authority. I was listening, to an audio book by, trying to remember the philosopher, only this week. I think it's Schopenhauer, or, what's the other one's name? SubhanAllah. Nietzsche. Okay, one of these two. I can't recall which one exactly. And he was effectively talking about kindness. No, actually, it was Machiavelli. It's Machiavelli, and he was talking about kindness and goodness. He says kindness and goodness, it has no value. It has little value without power. To be a kind or benevolent authority, a benevolent entity in this world, without power, is not a good thing. Okay, in his worldview, that the only time your kindness or the pen has any value to other people is when you have the power behind, you have the muscle behind. And therefore people see your kindness as an act of generosity. Why? Because you don't have to be kind. You want to be kind because you want to, but you don't have to be kind. But when you don't have the sword behind the kindness, people see that as a desperate measure to survive. It's a survival technique, so it's not the same thing. Right? So at the end of the day, the pen will only be effective after you've established yourself as an authority in the land. Once you've proven yourself to be capable of using the sword, when you come to using the pen, people pay attention to you. But if you are powerless, if you don't have authority, you don't have, people are not threatened by your presence, then the pen is just is seen as almost a form of compromise and desperation. The pen does nothing when you don't have the sword behind it. So once you've established that, when you begin to use the pen, it has tremendous effect, and people are willing to listen to you because they know if the pen doesn't work, we'll go back to the sword. If the pen doesn't work, we're going to go back to the sword. Yeah. These are tremendous lessons, by the way, not just when we study history, but just human interaction and human psychology, to understand that you need to use different instruments in different situations. Yeah, you need to use different instruments, different situations. As I said in the previous live stream on the Islamic governance session, I mentioned that the benefit of a pillow is to be soft, and the benefit of a hammer is to be hard. If you want to be a hard pillow, you'll be useless. And if you're going to be a soft hammer, you'll also be useless. Okay? So in a position where you're supposed to be using the sword, you need to be a good sword. In a position where you're supposed to be using the pillow, you need to be a soft pillow. We are currently a pillow that wants to be we want to be a hammer. We're a pillow right now. The Ummah is a pillow. But you would think we were a hammer. No, when it's time to negotiate, you need to think about how to negotiate properly. And when it's time to act, you need to know how to act. Yeah? You need to know which one to use, when to use it.
We're only a hammer to each other.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, on that note, let's go back to another topical discussion. So, we have seen in recent months, because the sister of the twin situation of Gaza is Syria. Okay? Syria is a case study that we have to juxtaposition next to Gaza. Okay? So, the Syrian situation has evolved since the liberation in December. And we have seen that they have gone for the pen. They're working towards diplomacy. And there are many Muslim pundits and critics who consider that it is inappropriate for the Syrian president to be so diplomatic. He needs to be more confrontative and more active in liberating Palestine and also repelling some of these factions in Syria. They want him to be more of a swordsman rather than a diplomat. Okay, they don't realize that his time right now is best spent using the pen rather than the sword. Okay? And if you doubt that, look at the response of the Muslim world in general to the fatwa that's been raised in the last couple of days. Okay, nobody's responding. Nobody's responding. Yeah, so there is a time for each, and he's using his time now to build diplomatic relationships, strategic alliances. He's going by the pen. And this is something that I believe is a prudent move, is a wise move. And we need to understand how things work when you get to that level of power and authority. So the same is the case at the end of a dynasty. So when the dynasty is coming to an end, in other words, when nothing else is working, when you're coming to the end of your reign, then you need to go back to the sword again. So it says, at the end of a dynasty, when the group feeling Asabiya weakens, so the people are divided. They're divided. There's no unity anymore, as our brother Yunus mentioned at the beginning. And the people decrease in number, and there's senility. So the empire grows old and feeble. This can be comparable to the Ottoman case. You see, in 1913, 1914, the Ottoman Empire was feeble, senile. It was in fact known as the sick man of Europe, literally. That was the moniker, the nickname that people utilized, the euphemism they utilized to describe the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. It was literally senile and old and decrepit. So at that point, there was a desperation and an existential crisis amongst the senior figures in the cabinet of the Ottoman Empire. And they decided to do what was effectively at that time perhaps the best thing to do in their mind, which was to go back to the sword. Okay, so they entered the Great War besides Germany and decided to go into basically the military mode. Although, quite frankly, they did not intend to fight very much, but they end up in a situation where they had to enter the war. And this is a very famous instance when the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire, right, issued the firman. Firman was the Ottoman term for a fatwa.
Command.
Yeah, the fatwa for the global jihad to begin. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful chapter in history. Oh my goodness, so fascinating, honestly, because jihad was utilized for political ends. It is actually a political instrument, but it was utilized by the Germans to completely sabotage the British and French Empire, because they had at the time in North Africa, in parts of West Africa, the Indian subcontinent, much of the Middle East, the British and French were ruling there. They had many, many colonies, and these were Muslims. So the Germans understood that if we can mobilize these Muslim subjects to jihad against their overlords, we will completely destroy the British and French. Because it's not possible to wage war in Europe, but also to contain hundreds of millions of Muslims in British and French colonies. Impossible. So they utilized the jihad card as a trump card. Okay, and then the British, of course, had to find a counter jihad to tackle that, and they found that in the Sharifan clan in Mecca, where they waged the jihad against the Ottoman Sultan. So they used jihad, right, for political ends. Interest. So that was November 24th, 1914, and this is the equivalent of what we have witnessed this week gone. This is the equivalent of what we have witnessed this week gone. Okay, the fatwa was being pronounced. Now the difference is this: when this fatwa is being pronounced, there is an army in place. Okay, there's a cabinet. So the young Turks were there. There's Jamal Pasha right here. Right? So the army was there. The people of influence were there. So when the fatwa was issued, although it was manufactured, because even the Sultan of the time, Muhammad Rashid the fifth, he wasn't actually in the know. He was only told about this the night before. Right? But the point being, as a sultan, he was just a figurehead. The real people were the military commanders, the ministers, the young officers, and the military men. They announced the jihad through the Grand Mufti, and the jihad began. Yeah, the jihad began. Today we have a consortium of muftis, and they're all pronouncing the jihad, the fatwa, but they don't have the buy-in of any of the influential figures in government, such as the ministers, for example, or the army. So that call to jihad is going to fall on deaf ears. Yeah? It's going to fall on deaf ears. So quite fascinating. So that was the case. They went back to the sword. So towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, when it was coming to the end, they went back to the sword. Up until then, they were negotiating the capitulations, the tanzimat. There was a lot of negotiation. The constitutional reforms, a lot of, you could say, penmanship, but in the end, it came back to survival mode. They went back to the sword. Okay, so Ibn Khaldun is actually quite accurate in his assessments here, and it makes a lot of sense. Actually, objectively speaking, it makes a lot of sense. So at the end of the dynasty, when there's nothing left, you go back to the sword. Okay, you go back to the sword. So in the mid-term, so in between these two extremities, so between the beginning of the actual empire and the end of the empire, in between, and this phase typically is the longest lasting phase. So in the mid-term, in the interim, the ruler can to some degree dispense with the sword. Yeah. So once you establish, you have tamkin in the land, you have sovereignty, and you have control over the region, the realms. You can put the sword away. Okay, you can put the sword away, not completely, but by and large, you don't need the sword anymore. Then he mentions in this position now, what comes into prominence is the use of the pen, because you need to be able to collect taxes, properties, and you need to enforce laws and regulations. So this is where the pen comes back into play, and it becomes the primary means of regulating the region and the laws and systems. So the pen is helpful for all of these things. The pen is helpful for all of these things. So diplomacy, administration, legal structure, all of this becomes powerful. This is why, for example, again, you look at the great conquerors in world history, Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. They were not only great Hammurabi, they were not only great military commanders, they were also great lawmakers. Yeah, and many of the laws that we inherit today in the Western Hemisphere are still heavily influenced by Napoleonic Code, for example, by the Hellenistic laws and systems that were developed after Alexander, and by the Roman canon. Yeah? These were primarily military expeditions, military men, but they left behind a lot of legal systems, structures, and conventions that we still, to this very day in this modern world, benefit from. Okay? Because the pen comes after the sword. So the pen then becomes prominent, and these rulers rely on the pen. So for the vast period in which there is no more warfare being waged, or at least not as vigorously as it used to be at the beginning, the pen comes into dominance. I remember reading once a book on Tasawwuf, Sufism, a very short introduction to Sufism, and one of the things that kind of was interesting, one of the theories in that book, was that when the Muslims under the Abbasid Empire had grown to become a world civilization, very rapidly by the way, and Baghdad was the epicenter of learning and culture and civilization, the Muslims had no more the need to face the external enemy. Okay? They didn't have the same need to face the external enemy. And so at that point, they effectively not resigned fully, but there was less emphasis on conquests. So instead of turning to the sword, they turned to the pen, and they began to use the pen. And this is why there was an explosion in cultural output at that time in Baghdad. There was a lot of emphasis on study, on scripture, on literacy, because the pen was now preeminent, and that became the new instrument of culture, civilization, and power. And so you find in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, once you've reached the apex, you've reached the upper limits or the upper reach of military conquest, what follows after that is cultural, you could say, influence, and an increase in that. Napoleon, when he enters Egypt in 1798 to 1801, he brought with him many scholars, and Napoleon at that time was in his late 20s, a young man. But wherever he went, he brought with him scholars, he brought in scribes, he brought with him artisans, he brought with him engineers. And one of the, in fact, quite interestingly, one of the cultural remnants and relics of Napoleon's time in Egypt is that he left many military academies in Egypt. He also left many military hospitals in Egypt, right? And these were things that were later on developed by Muhammad Ali Pasha, who comes literally the year after he leaves in 1801, and he develops on these foundations. So, and then of course Napoleon, of course, he brought back to France the Rosetta Stone, found in Rashidiyya, and then you have the explosion of the, you could say, Egyptology, and that's all cultural baggage, right? Cultural capital that came about as a result of a military conquest. The modern Muslim world, or the modern chapter in Islamic history, also begins with the conquest of Egypt. Yeah. So all of this is all tied together: culture, but also warfare, the pen and the sword. So essentially, the pen becomes now the primary tool that the rulers use. Right. So again, we find many examples of this. Okay, I'm just taking some pertinent examples in the region, but there are too many examples of this. All right, you find, for example, when King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud conquers the Hijaz and he becomes Saudi Arabia, he becomes more diplomatic. As I said, he got rid of his ikhwan, his military outfits, and he began to be more diplomatic. He began to negotiate with the British, first of all with Churchill, and then with the Americans, and he began to open up to the American influence and import into the Saudi kingdom. And he began to basically be more diplomatic. And he was actually supremely successful when it comes to diplomacy. He was known as a desert diplomat. Very, very, you could only be so. I mean, he managed to unify the entire region. over 30 years. So he had to be a very, very effective communicator. But he amplified that following Saudi Arabia being established in 1932. He became a very, very influential, let's put it that way, negotiator and power broker. Likewise, we have the very famous or infamous case here, Jimmy Carter, Sadat, Anwar Sadat, when he launches the final in 1978, the final Yom Kippur War or Ramadan War, September, October War, the final attempt, unified attempt of the Arab nations to attack and to recover Palestine. He manages to push them only so far as getting them to the negotiating table. Again, if you studied last year, we had the Shadow History series, we went into great depth here. So that structure and system at the time wasn't to necessarily defeat Israel completely. He wanted to use the sword to push them to the pen. So he pushed them far enough to be able to force them to come to negotiations. He pushed them far enough when he recovered the Golan, when he recovered the Sinai, the region that was previously taken by the Israelis under the Six-Day War. He recovered that, and they panicked. They panicked, right? And at that time, Bashar, was it Bashar? Yeah, Bashar Assad was in the north, and he was basically still fighting, but Sadat said to him, actually, I'm done now, okay? All I wanted to do was to push them to negotiations. I just wanted to use the sword to push them to negotiations, and once they come to that point, I'm going to use the pen. So he switched. When he got what he wanted, he switched. And that resulted in, of course, the joint Nobel Prize. We know what happened after that, right? We know what happened after that. So you need to know when to use the sword and the pen. Sadat, by the way, is maligned, and he's not a figure of high repute in the Arab world. I oftentimes take the controversial opinion that I think he was misunderstood. I think he was misunderstood in that he used the sword when it was necessary. And in fact, he redeemed Egypt and to a large part of the Arab world when he did that, because he was able to overturn the Jewish victory or the Zionist victory following the Six-Day War and recover land, right? But he understood, I can't go all the way, so I'm going to just go as far as I can go, and then I'm going to push them to use the pen. And that's what happened. Okay? That's what happened, exactly what happened. And then we know what happened after. It's quite complicated, the entire in and out of that. But the point being, he understood when the pen was effective and when the sword was effective. Okay? That's the point I'm trying to make here. So the pen is very important because, again, we are in many cases, in many of these nations where people want them to pick the sword, they're at the stage in their development where the pen is more effective. You cannot go to a Saudi Arabia, for example. I'm not picking a Saudi, I'm just taking as an example, a working example. You cannot expect a Saudi Arabia in 2025 to pick up the sword. All right? You can't expect them to do that. Because they're in the middle phase, or at least in the early phase of their dynastic development. Okay? They've passed the phase of using the sword. They're in a position now where economically, politically, strategically, they're enjoying, really, quite frankly, a position that many nations in that region would love to enjoy. Okay? Say what you like of the Saudis, but there are many nations in that region who would love to swap places with Saudi right now. So to expect that nation at this point in their history to pick up the sword is a bit, it's a bit unrealistic. Okay? That's why you hear, I'm going to make this point and you can disagree with me. When I hear people say stuff like, for example, yes, but Yemen is much more impoverished. Yemen is also doesn't have the same allies that Saudi has. Yemen doesn't have the same resources as Saudi has. Yemen is a war-torn country, yet still they pick up the sword. I said, of course they'll pick up the sword. Of course they pick up the sword. Because they're in a position where picking up the sword is the only thing left. So you want to compare Yemen to Saudi Arabia or to a Turkey or to a Qatar or to a Kuwait. You have to be realistic here. Okay? Yemen is in a position right now where picking up the sword only makes sense. What else are they going to do? Quite frankly. Okay? That's why they have to pick up the sword. You're comparing apples and oranges here. Right? If Saudi Arabia was in the position of a Yemen, a war-torn nation, believe you me, they would declare jihad. Right? So one is holding a pen, one is wielding a sword. You can't compare them. They're in different phases of development. Yeah. That's the reason why we have to understand the parameters in which certain nations are operating, their limitations, and where they are in the political spectrum. Syria is working its way towards that position. So again, when we hear people saying he should attack, he should fight, he should make jihad, you need to really understand what we're talking about, because Syria is not in a position right now where the sword will give it the maximum leverage it needs in the region. Okay? It's not in that position right now. It's not in that phase. It's not in that phase. He's trying to build capital. He's trying to build relationships. He's trying to develop something. And this is how dynasties work. I know it's difficult for us looking from the outside in, but you have to understand that this is a convention that nations and empires, for as long as we can recall as a human family, this is how they've been operating for a long time. It doesn't change overnight. It doesn't change overnight. Yeah. Things become difficult when you have to balance reality with what people think you should be doing at the time. Yeah. So, I mean, I find it very interesting. Why? Because we need to understand the parameters of politics. How does this thing work? Right? Why is it that Ibn Saud spent 30 years fighting, forcing his way through the Hijaz, and when he becomes the most powerful he can be, he's now the king of Saudi of the Hijaz. He doesn't want to fight anymore, right? For the person who doesn't look into it deeper, he's thinking this is the time to fight. So the Ikhwan said to him, now is the time, because up until now, you were the underdog. You were the challenger. You were the one coming in, right? And now that you become the authority, you don't want to fight anymore? Certainly now is the time to fight. Now he's saying, no, now is the time not to fight. Precisely because I'm the authority, now is the time not to fight, right? So it's quite interesting that, again, we need to keep that in mind. Brother Tahmid.
Ustad, I was going to mention, in terms of this, when you say momentum is also key, obviously if you've consolidated a large area, would it also be maybe wise to maybe go for a bit more as momentum's on your side maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Again, depends. You're right. If you have momentum and you have the mass as well, and you can maintain that momentum and mass, of course, yeah. But there is always a limit. There's always a limit to how far you can go. And also, what's the objective? Ibn Saud did not intend at all to have a khilafah. He never intended that. He never intended to have a pan-Islamic revival. He didn't have. His intention was very clear. I want to conquer the Hijaz. Once he reached that limit, that was it. Okay, he didn't want to go beyond the borders. He was not interested. He had what he wanted, and that was it. Okay, that's also a mark of a good leader, because you need to know where your limits are, and you don't want to transgress your limits. I remember back in 2020, when most of us were stuck indoors, right, with the what's that called again? What's the term they utilize for keeping us indoors? I forget the term. It starts with a
Quarantine.
Quarantine. Thank you. You have a quarantine. Yeah. So in that time, many people discovered trading, stock trading. It became a big thing, and I remember I began day trading, okay, on the side. And obviously, when you are learning something for the first time and you're indulging in that something, you're doing it based on instinct, right? You're not doing it based on principle. But I quickly realized that to be a good trader, after reading, studying, one thing a good trader does is before they begin trading, they have a limit. They'll write down, I'm going to make this much today, or I want to make this much today. I'll make $100 today for my trades. A good trader, he never overtrades. What's overtrading? Overtrading, for example, is you have $1,000, and at that time I was with a friend of mine. We invested a lot of money actually at that time. We made a lot of money as well, and we would trade. He was in Saudi Arabia, I was in the UK. We were trading together. It was quite funny because initially we were making a lot of money, and because of the momentum, as Brother Tahmid mentioned, the momentum was so great, we began to overtrade. So if we made $1,000 in one day profit from day trading, the fear of missing out kept us trading. And by the end of the day, we may have lost £300 out of that, $300. Right? So one of the principles of trading, because we went back to the books, right? It says before you trade on that day, have a daily limit for your losses and for your wins. And if you look at the app, the trading app, typically they have like an upper limit and a lower limit for trading. So that basically, if I lose more than 10% of my capital, I'm going to stop trading for the day. I'm going to close the app and walk away. If I make my limit, let's say I want to make $100 a day today. Once you hit $100, you need to close the app and walk away. Why? Because there's a risk. If you are too desperate, you can lose everything. Let's say you've lost $200 out of $1,000. And now out of desperation, you feel, actually, I've lost already 200. Why don't I just stay on and keep trading so I can recover something? You might lose everything as a result of that. But if you're winning, that's also a risk, because if you start winning and you go beyond your target for the day, you may feel like, I can do better actually. Right? Let me invest even more. And then you can end up losing at the end of the day. So a really powerful ruler, a shrewd ruler, he has a limit before he begins. A limit of how much am I willing to lose, first and foremost. If I lose this much, I don't want to lose more than that. I need to have a limit for how much I'm willing to lose, to sacrifice. And if I come to a point where the sacrifice has been reached, I'm going to stop. An example of that in the modern epoch was the president of Bosnia, subhanallah, Ali Izetbegovic, yeah, rahimahullah. He realized there is a limit to losing here, mate. I'm not going to lose everything. There is a limit to losing. And if I come to the point where my people are suffering, there's a threshold. I'm not willing to go below that floor. I'm not willing to lose everybody for the cause. Okay, I'm not willing to lose everyone. That's why I was quite unpopular actually when the war began in Palestine, and you'd hear people saying stuff like, we will fight until the end. I said no. There has to be a limit to how much loss can be sustained here. You need to have how much is enough. 10,000 casualties, 100,000. There has to be a limit. You can't just say until everybody goes. No, that's a sign of not having control of the situation. There has to be a limit to the loss, but also to the win. So even if you're winning, you have to have a limit. And Ibn Saud, I consider that a trait of a great leader is that when he won and he got what he intended to win, he did not overtrade his position. He didn't overtrade. He stopped. And he did the right thing, because had he overtraded and expanded into Kuwait and Qatar, the British would be after him. These regions were British protectorates. So had he tried to overtrade his position, he would have lost everything. Yeah. So again, with that having been said, I think sometimes we force our rulers to overtrade, and that's a danger. Yeah. And sometimes also we allow them to undertrade. When it's time to stop, you need to stop. Right? If you have a champion fighter in the ring and he's taken a beating, there comes a point when you as a trainer have to throw the towel in. Even if your fighter wants to fight, you need to throw it. Why? Because we don't want to take too much damage. We don't want to take damage that is irreversible. Sometimes you need to lose this battle to live to see another day. Right? So you need to have a lower limit and a higher limit. And so it's important that we have that in mind. But in any case, the pen, that's what the pen is for, basically. That's what the pen is for. Okay. So the pen is useful in this situation here. And it's something that sometimes we see rulers using the pen in a way that we don't see as being the optimal solution. Sometimes we think they're giving in too early. Sometimes we think they waited too long to negotiate, right? It depends on the situation, but we shouldn't lose sight of this principle. That's what I'm trying to say here. Don't lose sight of the principle. And if you've been trading, you will know what I'm saying. You would understand. You recognize what I'm saying to you. You have a good day and you keep going, you end up losing everything. Okay? Or you have a bad day, you want to be desperate to regain your losses, you lose even more. You need to have a limit for how much you're willing to lose on the day and how much you're willing to take and close the app and walk away. Brother Yunus.
Yes, Ustad. So I just want to ask, where would we like put, for example, like doing sanctions on Israel? So, for example, like what Europe and the US did on Russia. Is it would it be like the pen or the sword?
Sanction is the pen. Is a pen 100%.
Okay, Ustad. So why don't we do it? I mean, to come back to the example for trading, instead of like asking to do like let's say $10,000, which is like doing jihad, asking like Saudi to do jihad against Israel and asking every Muslim to do it. Why aren't we at least talking about like making $100? So just starting like sanctions, doing like some blockades, I
Is
mean,
it at
start
the state
somewhere.
level, at the state level, or as us individuals?
No, I mean at the state level, of
Yeah, I
course.
mean this. I'm gonna play the advocate here, right? I'm gonna play the advocate. Isn't that what the GCC was trying to do before October 7th?
I mean, no, sir, because if we talk about sanctions like they did for Russia, it will be applied like for all companies. Like, for example, if for example, just McDonald's, let's say, they are like serving like the Israeli army, they would be like forbidden from the country, and it would be like stuff like that. It's not just like for Israel. It would be like Europe did to Russia. So
I agree. I agree. I mean, I agree with you 100%. First of all, I think that's definitely something that should be done. The economic system has to be strangled in order for them to pay attention to us. I'm just being the advocate. I'm saying, wasn't that the process that the GCC and the members were actually taking? They were trying to find a way of drawing Israel into some sort of economic position whereby they can be undermined later on. That's one of the arguments out there in a way that
Yeah, they
by
were going to
buying them in, yeah.
normalize for a Palestinian state.
I mean, Ustad, isn't it like before October the 7th, isn't it like the country, like they were like normalizing the relations with Israel. They were like talking about recognizing uh, create like a new economic ties and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So
No, what I'm
maybe
saying,
we can,
what I'm saying is the normalization. Again, I'm not. If I should be very clear here, I'm not. I'm just giving an example. Yeah.
yes,
It
yes,
wasn't unconditional normalization. They were not saying we're going to recognize you. No, they were saying under certain economic guidelines and agreements, we're willing to, right, recognize this and that. But the underlying principle was at the end of all of that, Saudi would then potentially recognize Israel. But by that point, they have Israel under an economic, you could say, I wouldn't say prison, but they have them under economic pressure, or at least under economic guidelines that would be favorable for the Arab Muslims. Right? So were they not working their way towards that, where they can have the purse in their hands and therefore can now sanction, if they wanted to, Israel?
but I mean, now that we have like a literal like genocide, why aren't we like seeing like sanctions about that?
That's what I'm
If
saying. From the government states, from the government that we want to sanction, for them to take the sanction on board and make it happen, wasn't that the time? Wasn't the time for that before the war began? Wasn't it more effective then than now? Because is Israel going to really come to terms with the Arab nations calling it to some sort of economic alliance now when there is actually a full war? Is that going to be possible now? Now that it's actually about swords rather than pens?
But I mean, I'm not sure that about the sanctions. I'm not sure it's like solely pen for me. It's like a mix of the two, because it's like it's a strong, like it's something really serious when you hit like the economy of another nation, let's say. So how I see it right now is that the Arab countries and the Muslim countries in general, they
Mhm.
have like a good argument, even like say, like, you know, to the world, they are like in a good position to really make it happen. And even the public opinion will go with them, you know. They won't like create like let's say waves from the US government, or like there is less likely like it's less likely like that there will be like consequences of that.
And I'm sure you know that the oil sent to Israel is coming from Muslim nations. I don't want to mention which one during the war. So I don't think realistically we're going to see those nations boycotting Israel anytime soon. If they were still funneling oil to them, even in the early phase of the war. But it is an option. It's an
Yes.
option. I'm just saying, have we got the timeline wrong here? Should that not have been the initial step rather than the war itself? In other words, did Hamas use the sword too early in this case? Would it not have been better, maybe, as you're saying now, to use the economic sanction as a primary means of bringing them to the negotiating table?
I mean, my point was that I can't like say something like that, because, you know, we are not, I mean, I think that no one here really like is from Hamas, so we can't like pronounce on that. And no one here, I assume, is like from the Saudi government, so we can't
No. What
define
I'm not saying.
details about
Yeah,
that.
I'm not saying. I'm saying if that's an option, yeah, if that's an option that we should boycott, yeah, none of us. We're not. None of us is. Hopefully, some of us may one day be, but if we're going to consider this an option, was that not better at the beginning of the conflict than now? What will
I
it do to do it
mm,
now that it couldn't have been done before? That's what I'm trying to
I
say effectively.
I think we said this that for me, I guess that if Hamas did what they did it like for a good reason, and they know everything we are talking about right now, because like they are like on the terrain, you know, they were like living this, you know,
I would
they
disagree.
were like living this.
I would disagree with you strongly. My position is very clear. I would disagree because if it was for a good reason, today we would see the Muslim nations, or these nations, the Arab nations at least, would be they would be on board with what's happening. For example, the response of certain, not every mufti agreed with the fatwa, by the way. Some of them didn't agree. If you listen to their response, if you look at what justification they give or what logic they give behind it, you would see that clearly at least their nation wasn't on board with that. You know, one person said, did they notify us before they went into war, for example? This was a scholar, right? They never notified us before they went to war. Right? So now if you make a fatwa now calling us, you did not notify us before you went to war, but you want to call us now that the war is going a different direction. Yeah? So the cooperative spirit has to be there all the time to be able to, if you have allies, you need to let them know beforehand. That's the argument from that side. Yeah. So,
Hmm.
I mean, do you use the sword or do you use the pen? I would say, depending on the time, but you need to be able to do it in a way that makes sense. There's no point using a sword when it's time to use a pen, and likewise, no, you can't just suddenly now demand for a sort of action that would have been. I think personally, the chances would have been better and higher when they were still negotiating. The Arab nation was still negotiating. But
But
again, it's neither here nor there. I think we will disagree on that. But I think it would have been better if that was the card we want to play it then. Yeah, to have
I
played it
mean,
then.
we agree that it will have a tremendous effect on Israel if they start like the sanctions, like we said. My point is that, I mean, there are like steps before like a complete war, which we are talking about right now. Why
Mm.
aren't we like at least talking about the first steps, which should be like sanctions, like what Europe and the US did with Russia, for example. So why aren't we like talking about making $100 for now,
Mhm.
instead of talking about something like that is at least like it's
Go for the
kind of
million.
an utopia, like to imagine like bringing the Khalifa back and stuff. I mean, this is way too far. Let's
I agree.
yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I think we need to set, first of all, before we trade, let's set our lower limit. This is how far we're willing to go in terms of losses. We don't want to go beyond that, below that. But also in terms of our gains, let's be modest. Okay, this is how far we're willing to, or the minimum we're willing to accept as a gain. And we're not going to overtrade. There's a risk of overtrading here.
Yes, this is well said, Ustad. This is well said. And the minimum would be like at least that the government do something like sanctions or like complete to cut ties, like palpable stuff.
Exactly. I agree with that. I mean, I think there is hope that now that scholars have spoken, hopefully, the leading figures in those nations will at least try to do something. Will at least try to do something, at least to show that they're doing something. What my fear is that they'll ignore it completely, and that will completely kind of any authority these fatwa have would completely be effectively useless. Issuing a fatwa would have no meaning after that. If this is not taken seriously, then it will take away legitimacy of fatwas being issued for jihad, because this is an international organization of muftis. So I would hope that those people in power would take heed. At least if they can't do everything, they'll try to do something, so that we know that a fatwa when it's issued has an impact. Brother Anas, Brother Sufyan.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. Can you guys hear me?
Very well, very well.
I think if we're gonna speak from like action points, the way how things are, ceasefire is the most important right now. The way how things are going, because that's what needed, right? And even Israel is breaking his promise like again and again. But I think ceasefire is working toward Islamic nation to working toward, because ceasefire is basically, I'll say, one of the priority at this point. And I have the same fear with you, like Ustaz Ibrahim, is like if nothing is being taken serious, this is for the consequences that's gonna come. Especially me, like I have a lot of concern is that ulamas are not being taken serious. Whatever they say after that, there's gonna be very long lasting damage, because like if nothing were to be done, in my opinion.
I've heard that the sanctions in Russia, even though they're done by Europe and America, they have made Europeans suffer with energy prices, because I believe in Europe you're not getting the energy from Russia no more, and it's became more expensive. So if the Middle East and the Arab world were to do that on Israel, could there be retaliatory sanctions? Because with all the economic turmoil, like for example, there's tension in Turkey, we see sanctions in Iran, and we know that Iran is like a bubble waiting to burst. And with Saudi, right? I mean, there is this certain speaker that says that the Saudis will live on dates and milk for Palestine, which I think it's bogus, but I don't see how these populations can go from this high standard of living in the Gulf to being potentially sanctioned to having just everything go up.
I don't see that, to be honest with you. To be very honest with you, I don't see that.
Because there's somebody out there that advocates that they can live on that, but
where is that person? Where is he living?
He's in the UK. He's a popular
that's
speaker.
That's it. That's it. Khalas, that's it. How can you be in the UK and talking about people in Saudi Arabia eating dates and drinking milk, and you're going to be eating McDonald's and chicken burgers in the UK? As I say, never buy clothes from a naked man. Somebody's naked is not going to sell you clothes. Doesn't make any sense. If you're in Saudi, you can speak that way. But if you're not in Saudi right now, or anywhere, quite frankly, we can say that. We can all say that. But how realistic is that, quite frankly? To be distant in a place where you don't have the impact of those consequences. It's quite strange. People can speak this way publicly as well.
Yeah, and we see protests like in Turkey, which has been sanctioned before, and prices go up. And I don't know if them doing a sanction or cutting trade, turning off the pipelines, I think that nation
They were
might
providing oil. They were
crumble.
providing oil throughout the thing, you know.
I think with the secular opposition getting strong with all the protests, I think that nation might explode if Erdogan turned the oil off.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's not as easy as we think it is. It's just, yeah.
But at the same time, we see right now that the West among each other is having tension with the tariffs. So this might also be a good opportunity for these nations to use their leverage while, you see US and Canada are fighting each other, the EU and US, there's beef like in the West. And
do you think, this is, again, it's a wonderful conversation. It's a waiting game, you know. There are two ways to engage in warfare. It's either to be actively involved in weakening the enemy or to wait it out. You wait it out. Let them deploy their own, let them deplete their resources and their energy, and you wait it out. And when everybody does what they have to do, and it's like America comes into World War II at the last moment, or at least they sweep in, you wait it out. So I think many of these nations are sitting down and waiting it out. Because if Iran is kicked out of the equation, what was it called? The axis of resistance, right? I mean, there are many people who benefit from that because, we managed to, without being actively involved, we have seen the dismantling of our major competitors in the region without having to be involved and putting ourselves in the position of being next in line, but we get to see the others fall. So I think there are people who are observing that I want to jump in because I don't want to be a casualty in this, but I will stand to benefit from the casualties that come out of this. Yeah. So it's
there's some good developments too with Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds. They've all kind of like made a pact
for now,
and with President Ahmed Shara going to
for
the
now.
Gulf.
For now.
For now, yeah. These are some good positive developments.
Yeah.
I think
for now,
there could be a Sunni axis coming up.
For now. That's a very short-lived marriage, especially the Kurds and the Turks. When you have a common enemy, of course you can join for a common cause. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Well, what happens when your enemy dies? Yeah. Now he goes back to being that enemy's enemy becomes your enemy as well. Yeah. So okay, so that's in the middle term, which is the longest lasting period. The pen is useful because you need it for everything: diplomacy, the economy, everything, state building. You need the pen. Okay, that's what people spend most of their time doing, using the pen. So we shouldn't be surprised. Nations that are in their middle phase focus on the pen: diplomacy, economy. The thing you're seeing, basically, many of the more advanced Muslim nations, they're busy developing their economy, developing their infrastructure, the tourism industry. They're busy on these types of projects, and they're not necessarily reaching for the sword. Yeah? So therefore, he says, in that situation, the swords stay unused and in their scabbards. In other words, they are sheathed. In that situation, the swords are they're unused. They're still in their covers, unless something happens and they are called upon to repair a breach. In other words, unless those nations are themselves under threat and they have to defend themselves. Okay, unless those nations themselves are under direct threat and they have to defend themselves, the sword will remain in the scabbard. And again, this is why I'm saying nations that are currently, when you compare Saudi Arabia to Yemen and their you can say their respective response to what's happening in Gaza, you're comparing two different things. Yeah, one of them is in the middle phase. They're actually developing their economy. 2030 is around the corner. All of these projects. The sword is very well in the scabbard. It's not being unsheathed, right? Unless there's a direct threat to that specific nation and they have to repair the breach, they're not going to use the sword. And I think that's the situation in many of the nations around that region, including Egypt, including
sword back in
Jordan.
2019.
They dropped it. They dropped or they picked it up.
Yeah, they dropped it on Yemen back a few years ago.
Yeah,
when
well,
they
there
needed
we are. Yeah, of course. Yes, of course. Yeah, of course. Definitely, we can agree to that. So yeah, so the sword is still in the scabbard, unless, and you could say, there was a breach from the Saudi perspective. There was a breach, so they picked up the sword. Yeah, but it says unless there's a breach for that nation, they will not use the sword. They're not going to take action. In other words, which if we take that and look at what we're seeing in the world today, you could say objectively, none of these nations will respond to the jihad fatwa unless and until they themselves are direct victims of the Israeli attack or the Israeli transgression. Yeah. Unless these nations, like let's say Jordan or let's say Lebanon, which are nearby nations, or Syria even, or even Egypt, yeah, if they were to be the next in line, or the ones facing you could say the assault from the Israeli army, then they would perhaps definitely respond to the call for jihad and pick up the sword, because now there's a breach in their region and they have to defend themselves. But other than that, he says, other than that, the swords are not needed. Yeah, it's not needed. The sword is not needed. Other than that, the sword is not needed. Yeah, if it's not self-defense, if it's not establishing the dynasty, and if it's not the final phase when there's nothing left for you but to pick up the sword, there's no need for the sword. He says, yeah? There's no need for the sword. This is why you find many of the you can say freedom fighters, resistance fighters, later on when they reach the phase where it's just negotiations or diplomacy, they are anti armed resistance. They become icons of peace. So you have Yasser Arafat, you have Nelson Mandela, who later on in their life became icons of peace, right? They became people look up to them as icons of peace, yeah? Because at that point, the sword doesn't achieve what the pen can achieve anymore. So, men of the pen, and this is very important for us now, okay? We're going to stop here, but I want you to keep this in mind. Men of the pen have more authority. They occupy a higher rank. They enjoy more benefits and greater wealth, and have a closer and more frequent and intimate contact with the ruler. Yeah. So in that situation, men of the pen, so these are the bureaucrats, the diplomats, the politicians, the businessmen, the scholars, and generally people who have authority and influence. They have more authority. They have higher rank. They get more benefits. They have more wealth. They are closer most of the time and more intimate with the ruler. So these are the sorts of people that again, in Islamic political theory, they're known as, what are these people known as in Islamic political theory? This group of people. Exactly. Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. The people who tie and who unfasten. These are the people of influence. These are the people we should be looking for right now. All right. So if we want to enact the call for jihad, okay, let's theoretically, just for YouTube, then the first step is not to mobilize the masses to pick up guns or to travel to the borders of Gaza. The first step should be, we need to put pressure on these people. You don't go straight for the rulers. You go for these people, the local governors, the local representatives, the local imam who maybe has access to maybe the state council or whatever, the judges, the businessmen in the society, the popular figures, the influencers on social media, maybe potentially, right? These are the people you need to go to immediately, right? This is what we would have to gather, some form of group or organization that will go and find these people in society and pressure them to demand more from the leaders who they have contact with. Yeah? That's the process we would have to take. So we would identify these people. So for example, if you are living, let's say in Jordan, Jordan is basically a part of Palestine, East Bank, West Bank. Then you would, if you can't reach the king of Jordan, you would speak to the local representatives in your district, for example, and you would demand as a community that they raise this awareness, or that they give a statement, or that they begin to petition for something to be done. And if everybody did that in their constituencies, you would begin to have a solid progress in terms of, oh, now we can see there is really like a mass momentum. People are speaking to the councillors, or maybe the influential business people in that region. That's how we will begin to make an impact. You need to get to these people. They are the ones who will have access and influence over the ruler. Right? And also the military commanders, for example, they're also very, very, very key to get them. So that's where the effort should be at this stage. It shouldn't be one of the two extremes, which is the masses point fingers at the rulers and say, you guys, it's your turn now. You heard the fatwa, do something. Or the opposite, which is now let's every Muslim go out and pick up a gun and travel and wage jihad. These are two extremes. In between these two extremes, there are actionable, practical steps. Ibn Khaldun gives us the heads up here, says these are the people you need to think about. In this situation, these are the people you need to be contacting, you need to be working with, so they can leverage their authority, their influence, their proximity to power, and begin to affect change. And this is why in the early phase of the Khilafah Rashida, they would have people known as, or you'd have what is known as al-Wufud, al-Wafd. These are congregations that would come traveling from certain regions, from certain tribes, representatives. And they would go to the ruler, to the Khalifa, and they would petition him. Okay, so the people would go to these people who would be considered the representatives, and they would then send them to go and represent their case to the ruler. That's how change was affected. So the Ansar had their own representatives, the Muhajirin had their own representatives. In fact, when Sayyidina Hussein was assassinated in Karbala, the people of Medina sent a wafd to Yazid in Damascus. And they went, as a group, they went to speak to him. Under the Umayyads, that was a system in place. Sayyidina Muawiyah would receive them. Radiallahu anhu, he received them. They would come to him, he received them. That is how policies were changed. Okay, if it wasn't by the sword explicitly, that was how it was changed. So they would speak to these people in the community. Sometimes somebody is religious, has a religious rank in the community, people look up to that person. Other times somebody very wealthy, okay, who has the influence of being able to finance projects, or maybe lend loans and stuff like that to the government. Others may just be people who have a certain communal responsibility, and therefore people look up to them. These are the sorts of people that we would have to go to. They have the most sway and influence, and then you could have change, affecting change that way. And likewise, you find it even in the Western, for example, in the UK, you would have the local councillors, the local MPs. Right? You would go and petition them, or sign a petition, and they'd have to represent it in the House of Commons or House of Lords, whatever it is they do, right, in Parliament, to try to get momentum and awareness, and that's how change will be affected. This fatah will be affected that way. I remember a number of years ago, there was a media training I attended as part of a nationwide political campaign that was run in the UK against Islamophobia. And in one of the workshops, there was a question posed. If your relative was attacked and it was clearly Islamophobia, what would you do? Okay, you have three options. You either fight, you go and find that person who attacked your wife or your daughter, you fight them physically, or do you go and report it to the police, or do you just leave it, let Allah deal with it? Which of the three options do you think is the most productive? Does anyone want to give me an answer? Which do you think? Do you either go and fight that person physically, or do you go to the police, to the authorities, and report it? Or do you say this is a kafir system and they will never they will never assist us because bias and Islamophobia. I'll leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which of these three options would you go for, Brother Anas?
Report the police and like community member push the case.
Okay, why is that the optimal solution in your
First of
opinion?
all, like uh, every country we live in, there's a law and regulations, and we can't just close our eyes and say, "Oh, this Catholic country, I can't believe in their system." Like why are you living in it? Then leave, right? And thing is, if a man or a nation say they're just, we have to make them accountable for their own word, right? And basically, even though the system might be hard, but we at least we try, because if we actually take matter in our hand, that will be, instead of helping, it will against us. They will say, "Oh, Muslims are violent, they're barbaric." It will increase more Islamophobic narratives. It's like we're giving, we're helping the enemy rather than basically try to protect ourselves. Is For me, it's foolish. Somebody go and start punching the guys or something. But if he's in the field, he's in front of him, he defended there. If I'm saying like later on, whatever happened, we should pursue through law and regulations of that country.
And what about the third option, which is just leave it to Allah, just like pray about it, just let it go,
That's not
essentially.
Islam. That's not Islam. Where did he get that from? Because
I
Islam
want to
never.
tawakkul. I want to have tawakkul on Allah. I don't want to rely on human beings for my problems. I'm just gonna have tawakkul on Allah and just pray that something happens to that person who did that. You're right. So the answer they gave us is that you should always report to the authorities. And the reason being, if you don't report it, it doesn't form part of the statistics. So you have to report it, even if the person is never caught. You have to report it. And when you report it, you need to make sure you emphasize it was an Islamophobic attack, for example. Because what happens there is it enters the statistics, it enters the numbers. And beyond a certain level of reports, it will then be picked up under the radar when it comes to state policy. Okay, when it reaches a threshold, it becomes a key concern of the government, and now they are obliged, as you said, to either find regulations and laws to protect the minority. So they have to now act and pass laws and do something in parliament to address the issue. So by just reporting it, you're increasing the chances that this becomes a visible problem, a visible issue. And now those people who are making the laws are obliged to address it. Yeah? So likewise, the issue that, okay, what do we do now? We need to make sure it becomes visible. It becomes a visible thing. And we do that by going to the right authorities and raising the concern and telling them you need to do something about this. And then making sure that it's reported, it's documented, so that it becomes a problem that they have to address. They can't just ignore it. Yeah? They can't just ignore it. But you said if we take the action directly, we may be causing more problems than good. We may be causing more problems than good. But if you just leave it, let's just pray and leave it, then you're not contributing to the solution. You're doing nothing. Yeah, you're doing nothing. So it takes a systematic approach, and one that is, very, very well organized, structured. It has a goal in mind. There's a reason why you're doing what you're doing. It has a goal in mind. So when they explain that, it makes sense to me. Yeah, you're right. Actually, if you report it enough, it enters the statistics, and therefore they have to measure and also report on improvements. They have to pass laws, and they have to make it possible so that these things never happen again, or at least if they do happen, there's a consequence, and they can report that they've done something positive to mitigate the risk. Brother Sufyan.
So I think also if you report it, your story could make it on the news as well, which would raise more awareness. And I've even looked, I remember when there was an Islamophobic incident, I even watched like a right-wing channel report this, and if you read the comments, there was a lot of sympathy for the dead Muslim that you wouldn't see years ago.
Exactly, yeah, you make it visible, basically. It becomes visible. It becomes visible. It becomes visible, The ulama have done their part. They've made the announcement, okay? And if the people now in these nations, even in the West, quite frankly, were to take that and not to go and pick up guns and travel, no, but were to take that and were to make this visible and relevant, like going to the people who they have authority or have influence in their immediate community or within their district or whatever it is that the system is at the time, then you can actually you can amplify that voice, and you can make it important and valuable for people at the higher up level to have to take notice and to have to do something about it. So again, we have to use the pen for that, but it's very interesting. He mentions that, and these are of course people who you can't even select a leader without them. They are that important. Yeah, they are that important to the system and structure of Islamic governance. They are that important. Let's take 5 minutes, inshallah, and then we'll end. Any questions, any commentary, anything else? And this is, by the way, one example of someone who's highly influential, as we're going to follow up and finish with the Saudi example. Does anyone know who this man is?
You just talked about him. Isn't he he was the director of Aramco, maybe?
He was the Saudi finance oil minister, Zaki Yemeni.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
Zaki Yemeni. Very, very influential. In fact, it is said he masterminded, architected the oil embargo. You know, you mentioned earlier on they should boycott, they should cut the oil. That's exactly what happened in the 70s. That's exactly what happened. And they almost crippled not only Israel, but the entire Western Hemisphere. That was very effective. That was very effective. But he was somebody who was in that influential bracket, a minister, very wealthy, very influential. And because he was on board with the message of taking action, he utilized what he had best, which was his knowledge of the economy. He's a finance minister, the oil minister. And so he was able to also working to support King Faisal, was able to pass a policy that was so devastating that, quite frankly, even the Americans were preparing to just raid Saudi Arabia. Okay, they need the oil that badly. So this is, yeah.
Yes, I just about what you are saying. Isn't it like the perfect moment for the Muslim leaders to do something? Because not only they can just say, you guys pushed us to, I mean, they can just say like to America and, they just can say, you guys pushed like our populations to rebel against us. If we don't do anything, I mean, they will kill us. So one of the reason why, and also the West is like in a crisis moment. So isn't it like the perfect moment to do something? I mean, you can do better than that to act.
It's a waiting game, isn't it? That's the thing. So if there was uniformity amongst the nations, they could do that. But because everyone is waiting for the other one to do it first.
But Ustad, sometimes this is so, you are like at some really critical timing. Like it seems like they don't even take a risk doing that, since the West is like in pure crisis with Russia. They have like tons of problems. They are like disintegrating. There has been like a continual genocide in Palestine. I mean, if you don't do something now, when would you do something? Because if you wait more, like you said, it's a waiting game. But sometimes if you wait too much, you give the time for the. I mean, I don't want to use the word enemy, but I don't see like the West as an enemy per se. But you know what I mean? I mean, they are the ones like creating this situation in Palestine, at least. But if you give too much time, you will miss like the opportunity to act. So I guess that's my point, because you can't just wait indefinitely.
That is true. But what's the impetus? What is the force behind taking action? What would force these nations to take action?
Yes, Ustad, and that's why I wanted to jump to the second point, is that, like you said, it's like we say in French, c'est bien beau de parler de. It's like it's nice to talk about government and they should do that and they should do this, but in our scale, like you said, what can we do like exactly concretely? Like you go to the representative and do what? You do a letter? What should we exactly do? You know, what type of letter? What should we say in it? Like,
This is like, you're right. Let me ask you this. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he entered Medina, okay? So Medina, they had a problem. Aus and Khazraj, Aus and Khazraj, Aus and Khazraj. Yeah, because Banu Qurayza and Banu, they kept, so there's always warfare. What did they do? They sent a delegation to Mecca. They sent a delegation to Mecca to go and seek a solution, right? So they went to speak, they went to petition, they went to present their case, and through a series of such delegations going back and forth, they came to a conclusion. We have an offer for you. If you come and solve our problems, we'll give you this. Protection, security, we'll follow you, obedience, you'll have a place to operate from. It was a give and take. You don't just go to these people of authority and just demand from them. You need to also offer something, okay? There has to be an exchange. So they came and said, oh, we will do this and this and this. He said, if I come to you, I demand that you support and have obedience, right, and be patient, and they offered that. So there was an exchange there. But the point being, it was a small delegation of Medina, Madanis, who went there. And when that contract was actually secured, then they can act upon the rest of it. Now the stage is hijrah. Hijrah begins. Right? There's a process called hijrah. Hijrah begins. Then there's mobilization. When Medina now becomes an Islamic state, there are new laws that are passed now. There are new conventions. There are new systems. The economy is developed in a way. So it's a process, but it begins with that representative body taking the first step. We have problems in our society. We want solutions. We're coming to you because we believe you're capable of providing solutions. Right? So now you negotiate. What do you want from me? What can we give you? That's how it works. I don't think it's going to change just because we live in the 21st century. Yeah, you need to offer something in order to receive something. And especially in the Arab world, this tradition is still very strong. It's very strong. The tribal representatives is very strong in the Arab world. So maybe for us in the West, we're a bit distant culturally, that we can't see how that would work. But in the Arab Muslim world, tribal chiefs still have a lot of influence. Still have a lot of influence.
I mean, Ustad, here in Morocco, we have like someone who is called Wakil al-Malik, which is like a representative of the king in each like neighborhood, let's say. So maybe this is an example of what you're saying. Like this is like the person who people can talk to about those matters, but it would be like awkward, like just going to him and talk about Palestine. You know, what would you say to him?
Well, this is
what can you offer to him? I mean,
this is where we should be focusing our time on, isn't it? Instead of being on Twitter talking about Saudi Arabia, why don't we talk about what we can do in our own nations? What do we formulate? Where do we go? Let's look at the letters that the Prophet ﷺ sent. Or let's look at what the people of Medina said to him when they came to Medina. What was that deal like? What was the actual negotiating point there? What were they negotiating? They had negotiating points. What was it? So how can we replicate that? What can we offer these people in these tribal positions or maybe these regional positions? How can we entice them to do something? That's the way we should be working. We can make an effort that way and make impact that way. It can work. But if we don't think that way, we're thinking just the leaders have to do everything, or just it's only going to happen if they do something, we're missing several stages and steps in the process. They're not going to do anything. As our sister Yasmin says, these men of the pen, they're not going to do anything, sister, unless there is an incentive for them to do something about it. I'll give another example from the Quran. Does anyone remember the incident in Egypt where Al-Malik, the king, had a dream, and in this dream he saw some quite strange things? Who did he call when he woke up? Who did he call? When the king had a vision, had a dream, and he was perturbed by this, who did he call?
Sayyidina Yusuf.
No, he didn't call Yusuf alayhi salam.
Oh no, his minister or yeah, his yes.
Al-Mala, Al-Mala, Ya Ayyuha Al-Mala, waftini bi, Al-Mala. These are the people in the community, his entourage. These are people who have influence, who are close to him, right? These are his advisors. These are the people who are supposedly, they have knowledge and they have expertise that he needs to run his government. He called them. When Bilqis received the letter from Sayyidina Sulaiman, who did she call? Who did the Queen of Sheba call when she received the letter from Sulaiman alayhi salam?
Her advisor, I think.
Yeah, her council. Yeah, her council. Subhanallah. So find these people then in your society. Find these people and speak to them so they can carry that message to the rulers. Yeah. So when Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, he was in jail. And the entourage, al-Mala, they didn't have the solution. But there was one person in that entourage who was actually a slave. He wasn't even a minister. He was a slave, but he happened to work in the palace. What did he do? He said, oh, I know someone. Right? So the very fact that he was in that circle, even though he wasn't even a minister, that one person saved the nation. He was able to go to a man who knew the answer and he conveyed it. Right? So that one person, it can be an imam who prays, maybe in that region, who has, maybe he's a, it can be anyone. Likewise, when Sayyidina Musa, his life was in danger in Medina, in Egypt. Who came to him running, telling him, you better leave the country? It was a man in the circle. When Fir'aun was plotting and planning with his advisors, there was one man there. Right? So these are the people who have the proximity to power. They have They don't have to all be powerful. They have proximity. And that proximity puts them in a position where they become valuable because they are a conduit between you and the ruler. So when the man came to Yusuf, alayhi salam, Yusuf ayyuha as-siddiq, aftina, tell us, help us, give us the answer. We have a problem. From the higher level, I'm coming to you. And I'm asking you for the solution. And then he was able to introduce Yusuf to who? To the king. Subhanallah. The connection is made. Yeah. So there are people in the society who would be considered Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, or at least they have a connection to that authority structure. How do we mobilize to get these people on board so they can be a conduit between us and the people above? This kind of work is difficult because it's not the kind of work that is glamorous. It's not as easy as making noise. And no, this is difficult work and it's long-term work as well. But that's the work that's what works effectively. That's how you gain that level of proximity and you can have impact in the long term. Those people at the top who are enjoying, as he says here, they have higher rank, they have authority, they have many benefits, they have wealth. They're not going to do anything without some sort of incentive to do it. They're not just going to do it because their conscience won't allow them to sleep. There has to be a reason why they do it. Why did the man come to Sayyidina Yusuf? Does anyone know the motivation for that man who was a slave in the king's court? Why did he go to Sayyidina Yusuf? What's the motivation? Does anyone know the motivation?
I guess he was hoping to be liberated.
No. There was a specific motive.
I don't remember.
Okay. So if you look at the wording, when he speaks to the king, he doesn't say to him, I'm going to go and ask Yusuf. Or I know a man who knows. He says, give me time, let me go and I'll come back with the answer. He wanted to present the answer as his answer. He wanted to get the answer and to present it as his answer. So his motive was, I'm going to get the solution, I'm going to present it as my solution, and potentially I'll get something out of that. Okay? So his motive, therefore, was recognition. He wanted to be recognized. Now, if you have a community of people, and you know somebody that maybe is a councillor, a local governor, whatever it is, and you offer him that we can recognize you, or by doing this you'll be a champion in the community, maybe the king or the president, whatever, right? The need for recognition is strong in these people. Play with that, right? And if you don't do it, we're not going to recognize you, we're going to boycott you, whatever it is. At least in our region, we'll boycott you. Right? That's a strong motivator for many political actors. They want to be recognized, right? So these are things that there are many ways to affect these sorts of things. It doesn't have to necessarily just be we just point direct to the ruler. There are many stages in between that, and these people are more accessible to us than the king or the president. They're more accessible to us because in our communities they'll be there, in our districts they'll be there, in our constituencies they'll be there. And again, in the Arab Muslim world, it is a lot stronger because of the tribal connections. You know, when Sharif Hussein wanted to mobilize an army against the Ottoman Sultan, who do you think he went to? Who do you think he went to for support? He went to the tribal chiefs. He went to the tribal chiefs, yeah. If you look at Lawrence of Arabia, when he was in Arabia trying to start a rebellion, who did he go to?
The Bedouins.
Yeah.
He went to the tribal chiefs.
Yeah.
Ibn Saud, who do you think he went to?
The chiefs.
To the tribal chiefs. King Faisal, when he was kicked out because he was a finance minister initially and also foreign governor, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, when his brother Saud was in power, they had a misunderstanding. King Faisal was kicked out. Who do you think he went to? The tribal chiefs in the desert. Right? So there's a pattern here. It's very clear. When you look at Gertrude Bell in Iraq, who do you think she was going around? If you look at her diaries, she went to the tribal chiefs. So, I mean, it's there. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his message went to the kings and the tribal chiefs and to the emperors. Right? So these are things that are there. In fact, in certain groups, where the effort is made to literally have this impact in society, they have cycles of 7 years. Yeah? 7 years, every 7 years. And one of the protocols is something known as Talabun Nusra, to seek support. And they will, if you look at the manuals, and they'll tell you, we want to go to influential people in society. We want to go and seek support. So we're going to go to the generals. We're going to go to the judges. We're going to go to the politicians. We're going to go to the businessmen. We're going to go to the religious authorities. We're going to go to the people in society who have generally, fame and access. Right? We're going to work with these people, and we're going to remind them of their responsibility for Islam. We're going to remind them of what Allah has blessed them with. We're going to entice them also that, through you, Allah could use you for khair, for the ummah, for the nation. We're going to speak to these people, and it may take us 7 years to reach them. But if we have them on board, we have more capital and leverage with which to press for the government to change. This is long-term thinking. Okay, that's how it works. That's how you actually go about making a change. So, who are the people in your community who could be considered Ahlul Hal wal Aqd in your district, in your tribe? Yeah, speak to them about this issue, about the fatwa, or what can we do in the community. It begins that way, because the pen is what will make things happen in the long term. The sword is a short-term thing at the very beginning when there's nothing established, or at the very end there's nothing left to lose. The pen comes in, or maybe in times of direct threat for the nation, the sword comes out. But outside of that, he says, there's no need for the sword. They are not needed. And the authority lies with people who have the pen in their hands. Barakallahu feekum. Again, we'll be back next week. As we always do, we'll have a reading of the Muqaddimah. This recording will be available, inshallah, on the YouTube channel in hopefully 24 hours. And we can continue the discussion in the Telegram group. Thank you once again for your patience and for your participation. Inshallah, we'll speak next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Alaikum assalam wa
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Once your work is finished, don't watch the television. Once your work is finished, find something constructive to add to your mind. Have an hour for reading. And I don't mean read comic books. Read something that will make you know what's happening So when you get into conversation, you can sound intelligent even if you aren't.